Hello, hello. Welcome to Science of History. I'm still setting up my stuff.
Testing. Hello.
Yeah.
We are just a little bit late today. Got to have the outlines printed up and everything, but we'll get started in just a second.
Were we on time? I don't think we've been on time for a couple. Yeah.
So those of you who are avid listeners of ours who always tune in at 4, be advised,
You can see me. I mean, you can see me on campus, and you can let me know your displeasure.
Yeah.
Let's
Please
go
let us know.
Mano a mano.
Exactly.
Actually,
have you been approached by anybody yet, Andy?
Like Tom.
Tom. Okay.
Tom,
Cool.
yeah.
Shout out to Tom, our biggest fan.
Yeah. He seriously. He's like. He was saying. He was like, I haven't gotten around to the last one, but I'm going to listen tonight. I'm like. Yeah, soldier
absolutely.
salute. Soldier salute.
The Irish Rebellion, man, big deal.
That is a big deal.
That was a fun one.
Yeah. Okay. Are you ready?
Yep, sure. Let's get started.
All right. Welcome to Science of History with Anton and Andy. And today's topic is the English Civil War. And I made a remark to Anton earlier on how we're kind of doing things backwards, and that our first episode ostensibly was about like the Russian Revolution, which is like the culmination of like revolutionary like history up to that point. And now we did the French, and then we did the Irish. And the Irish War of Independence, actually, a lot of the justification for that is due to the Cromwellian conquest of Ireland during this period. So we're kind of going backwards there because Cromwell is not very much reviled in Ireland, right?
Or not very much liked, for sure. Like he, not a very popular figure in Ireland, and I think we did mention him a couple times.
Yeah.
We even, I think, included a quote about him. So those of you who are interested in maybe some more context from the Irish side of things, we'll talk about that a little later. But I mean, if you're interested in the Irish context, definitely check out our YouTube channel. What's this? It's Science of History.
Science of History. I'm going to add the call sign WMTU 919 to make it easier for people to follow. I'll also put the link on the WIM2 website. That'll make things easier.
Yeah, the algorithm does not like small creators. So
no, they're hating on white boy excellence here.
Yeah. I don't know if I'd phrase it that way, but
yeah, I'm just messing around. All right. So the English Civil War kind of stems from, this is kind of a parliamentary versus royalist conflict. Parliament, in this case, stems from this tradition of bishop advisory councils, or councils that would advise the kings on certain matters, right? They would meet every so often, discuss with the king, what's the best course of action. And then, everybody would go on their way. Divine right of kings, absolute autocracy, right?
Right. And for some context, of course, as we know, England had a Protestant church already at this point, which is a huge deal. The Anglican Church, some of you might be patrons of that church. So
if you're an Episcopalian,
if you're Episcopalian, you're also sort of part of that tradition for sure. And that was the sort of reigning religion in England at the time of Cromwell.
It was the national religion.
Exactly. Yeah. Not only just majority, but also national religion.
You were compelled to.
Yeah, and
to attend church.
For sure. So there was different waves of like compulsion when it came to Anglicanism in Britain around these times. And we'll talk a little bit about the kings, because some of the kings were Catholics, but they were the head of a Protestant church.
Yeah.
Which is a little bit of a
tension.
You can imagine why that would cause some problems.
Yeah, and when you talk about like rulers that were the head of, the national churches, obviously very famously Bloody Mary, Mary the First, was a Catholic who came to power, and then very, I would say, violently suppressed the previous, Protestant Protestant speakers, and she was known as Bloody Mary. And there was actually a book of martyrs that had her kind of as like an antagonist. It was like this book of Protestant martyrs that were upholding the true Anglican English faith. And, Mary had done all these horrible things.
And it was all about, in using the interpretation of the Bible. So we're not going to get into the differences between the Anglicans and the Catholics, but it was very much a movement away from a papal-centered religion to a more government and national religion.
Correct.
And Anglicanism really played into national identity politics at the time. And I think that, a majority of the barons and the ruling class, they they maybe not originally, but they definitely started to see the use of having a state religion that they could sort of rely on for their own power.
I agree. And with this story, the English church, the Anglican church, features very heavily into it. One might even say it's kind of the core component of our story, right next to the throne of the king, right? Mm-hmm. But the religious aspect of this Civil War is a bit of a matter of debate, but obviously one of the figures that we're going to be talking about today, Cromwell, was very heavily religious. So that is one reason to kind of place it more in that aspect, right?
And he hated Catholics as well. That was a big part of his identity. And one of the reasons for this was because in 1605, there's something called the Gunpowder Plot, which some of you might be familiar with. Remember the 5th of November? Yeah. If you've seen V for Vendetta, that's like a weird part of that. I'm actually not really sure what the connect. Have you seen V for Vendetta? Have you read the
I read like the graphic novel.
Okay,
after,
so you read the original.
When I was like in 8th grade though, and it was horribly gruesome and raunchy. Even as like an 8th grader, like as an 8th grader, you're like interested in this thing. As an 8th grader, I was like, this is a lot.
It's fine, but and honestly, the connection between that and the Gunpowder Plot is kind of weird. The Guy Fawkes mask that is like used as like a symbol of rebellion nowadays is from Guy Fawkes, who actually perpetuated the Gunpowder Plot in 1605. The reason I bring it up in our context is that the Gunpowder Plot was a plot by Catholics to blow up the Parliament against King James, and they failed. But there was a lot of repression against Catholics at the time, and the general mood in the country at that time was anti-Catholic, very, very severely, and Cromwell was growing up around this time. You know? So there's like these ideas of where does this like anti-Catholic, strong anti-Catholic sentiment come from with Cromwell? In my mind, when you're growing up in a situation where everybody hates Catholics, people are like finding Catholics, priests are having to hide under like houses and stuff like that. That still actually exists in England. If you ever go to England and you're looking at it from a Catholic context, so if you're like going like Catholic tourism in England, they'll show you like the priest holes where the priests used to hide inside walls and under floors and stuff like that. And that was all during this time, you know, the really serious Catholic sort of oppression in England.
And there is this movement in the church. So this Anglican church, splits from the Catholic church. But this Anglican church still has a lot of its Catholic heritage, right? There's some people that really want to emphasize this heritage, make it more sacramental. These are called high church, even though that term doesn't come into parlance until after this whole conflict. I'm going to say high church for the rest of this.
We're just going to use that as a byword.
And then there are some people that said, well, the Reformation was good, but it didn't go far enough. We need to completely purify these Catholic notions, these filthy papists
are known as
the Puritans, right?
And we might be familiar with them in an American context because they're the ones who showed up on the eastern seaboard of the United States and had like a very famous colony. It wasn't the first colony. It wasn't even like all that important really in the grand scheme of things. But it was no. But like, you know, a lot of people think they were the first. A lot of people think that like, they arrived first, they established the first colony. But that's just not true, you know.
It was like a
Jamestown.
Cod, there's like a cod thing
Roanoke
going on.
And stuff like that. There was a lot going on. But the point is, they're the Puritans. And when you think of Cromwell as we talk about him today, keep in mind, this guy was essentially the same stratum as these people that we think of as the Puritans. With the hats and the buckles and the witch burnings and, you know, the all the stuff.
And I will say they looked swag. Maybe
they've got drip.
The Cavaliers might have had more swag, but I don't know.
The Cavaliers, who will come into play a little later, they definitely had a lot of swag. They wore a lot of feathers in their caps. I think they looked pretty good. But Andy is into the Puritan drip.
You're right.
One thing I will say about the Anglican Church before we get started, the Anglican Church remains probably the most sacramental, the most close to the Catholic Church of any of the Protestant churches, in my view. I think that if you ever go to an Anglican service, it's like, well, it's very obvious that it is Catholic inspired. It's
right.
like decaf Catholics.
But this Catholic influences, these Puritans just hated it. They saw it as like a very papist. The Puritans were Calvinists. And if you think of like, Protestantism as this anti-Catholicism, the Calvinists were highly, anti-Catholic. They didn't believe in like an episcopal structure, really. So the Church of England was structured as an episcopal structure, and that's going to
with bishops
come into play later.
Yep.
Calvin believed that, and this is a little interesting thing, that in the New Testament, the Greek words like presbyter and I want to say it's like ecclesionos or whatever. The Greek word I'm saying there probably isn't correct, but basically the word for like an episcopal and a presbyter were actually identical. So churches should actually be governed instead of in this episcopal structure. The original structure of those early churches was Presbyterian, which you might,
Yeah, well, you might recognize. They will come into play.
Right.
In Scotland at this time, huge Presbyterian rising.
Yes.
Or rising feeling, rather. But later, obviously, that played into wars. They were super, super commonly Presbyterian. There's still Catholic sort of holdouts out there as well.
Yeah.
But at this time, England, Britain in general was facing a lot of Protestant, like sort of like introspection, I would say almost. Like there was a lot of movements that were sort of sometimes at odds with each other, sometimes not.
Yeah.
They were definitely moving in a way that was not away from the Catholic Church and towards their own sort of identity. In Ireland, this was not really happening as much. And obviously, if you've listened to our Irish Rebellion podcast or radio show, rather, I should say, it didn't really take as much root, and that caused a lot of differences and a lot of troubles. But that's a different story.
Right. And so we are kind of covering like the religious background of this to kind of cover a bit of maybe the material background. I'm just going to say James Stewart, quite a popular king. However, King Jim, right?
The sixth and first.
Right. Yeah. And I believe this, and you could correct me here, but King Jim, with his being the sixth and the first, that was actually a personal union of Scotland and England, and that's important.
Yeah, exactly. It is important. And I don't know how familiar listeners are with Scottish history, but the Stuarts are actually descendants of a famous king called Robert the Bruce. If you've seen William Wallace or whatever, Braveheart, that's that whole thing, Scottish independence and all that, that resulted eventually in the crowning of King Robert the Bruce. And that was like a time when Scotland was this huge independent kingdom. And England never actually beat Scotland ever. The way that they were united was through the Stuarts, who became the reigning monarchs of both Scotland, which they had already ruled, and England, which they had not ruled before. And this was a little odd because the kings of Scotland were Catholics, traditionally. And so when King Jim came to England, it was a huge, as we've talked about, there's a huge sort of question of why is a Catholic king in charge of a Protestant country? And that did not, obviously, if you're a student of history, you know it did not end well for the Stuarts. It's not going to end well for one of our main characters today, for King Charles, King Chuck. But later on, and I think we're going to cover the Jacobite rebellions at some point very soon. And if we do that, you'll learn more about, the fate of the ultimate fate of the Stuarts and why the current king, King Charles, is not a what we call a natural descendant of any of these people. I think through the female line, but mostly not.
Yes. And so we kind of have this King Jim who there was these suspicions that were starting to bubble up, but I believe King Jim was still relatively a popular king, right? Similar to France, how Louis the Well-Beloved was followed by Louis the Beheaded. This is kind of a very beloved king followed by a king that was wrong person, wrong time. And he spent a lot of money. England was in the 30 Years' War at this time. Or like towards the end of his rule, he got into the 30 Years' War. That's a whole other can of worms. Basically, war of religion, extremely devastating, extremely costly. And
ultimately a failure for the English and the British, rather, I should say.
And we'll get to that once Charles comes. But Stuart basically spent so much money, and Parliament was like, oh, stop spending money. And he's like, wait, Parliament can do something? Because he was very used to manipulating the Parliament of Scotland.
Yeah, because in Scotland, it was still a very old-fashioned model where the king sort of had ultimate power.
Yeah, and he ran up against this parliamentarian tradition descended from these like bishops' councils that eventually became like baron. In my view, I see Parliament at this time a bit of a reassertion of older aristocratic rule.
So would you consider the parliamentary system and the parliamentary sort of tradition, would you consider that a bishop thing? Because I've always thought of it as a baronial control.
Right. So the parliament stems from this clergy, gentry, it stems from these advisory councils that would advise the king in very old times, right?
Yeah.
And then you have, and I'm not super familiar with Magna Carta King John history, so listeners might have to do their own research.
Yeah, well, I can talk a little bit about it.
Okay.
It's in 1215.
Yeah.
There's a charter that was written. It was written actually by an archbishop, Archbishop of Canterbury, who is traditionally the sort of head of the English churches, really, even in Catholic times. And but that was, Magna Carta was essentially a group of rebel barons who wanted more power.
Right.
And they were like, well, this guy is weak. Our king is weak, King John.
Yeah.
And heck, why are we taking orders from this guy?
Yeah.
Why don't we have more power?
Right.
So, but I think there was a lot of synergy and a lot of movement.
I believe
between
so.
the bishops and the barons.
I see the Parliament in this time from 1215 into the Parliament of this as a kind of an assertion of aristocratic rule, right? And maybe this is too into left field, but a traditional like Vicoist view of history is, it goes aristocracy, oligarchy, and then monarchy, I believe. And so I would say like some students of history might see this Parliament as a reassertion of aristocracy in this period of monarchical rule. And
both James and his son Charles actually actively worked to suppress discussion of the Magna Carta.
Correct.
Interestingly. So obviously they were fully aware that the divine right of kings was sort of on its way out. And there was like this very strong kind of parliamentary leaning on this Magna Carta document. So, yeah.
Right. And Jim, basically, King Jim, you got me saying it. King Jim.
You got to say his full title, King Jim the Sixth and First.
King Jim the Sixth and First, right? At this time, Parliament has the power to levy taxes, and this is huge because Parliament could only be called by the king. I'm talking in King Jim's time. Parliament can only be called by the king, and they're basically an advisory board, but they had this huge de facto power in that they were really the only ones that could raise significant amounts of money.
So every time the king needed money,
he would call Parliament. Right.
Yep. Or raise taxes or do anything like that.
Right. And so King James calls the Parliament, and he's like, he just expects this to be like, walking to the ATM. And then he's like, Parliament is demands?
Yeah.
So eventually he reaches a bit of a compromise for some cash. He cedes some like parliamentary power, a little bit of power to Parliament for more.
Slippery slope.
Yep. To fund. He was known for living a very lavish lifestyle, but also was waging war at the time, 30 Years' War. And so Jim dies, and now we're on to Charles I. And Charles I very much believed in this divine right of kings, right? That the king was preordained, like before birth, to be this benevolent ruler of his subjects, appointed by God. And he was also, interestingly enough, while we were talking on the religious background, he was very high church, like I said, very into the sacraments, tradition. And at this time, there was definitely this movement, but a movement that was gaining dominance and power was this Puritan movement that wanted to purify it. So this is a completely at odds with England at the time, and English religious thinking at the time, and he was interested in making all of England into this religious uniformity. And he has this advisor, Archbishop Laud, who he and him worked together in order to innovate all England, Scotland, and Ireland into this high church religious uniformity. And
which you might imagine
doesn't always go well. And this was kind of one of the larger points of contention with him and the rest of the populace. And he also, interestingly enough, this is something we've talked about on the show, marries a Catholic, Henrietta Maria, who was House of Bourbon, right, from France. And people are like, is this actually a French Catholic agent that is seeking to destroy the true Protestant religion?
People talk. People talk about that
People always talk about the king's wives. I think People magazine, tabloids.
It's not a new invention.
Nature, human nature,
right?
That's
not a new invention. That's been going on since prehistory.
Right. And this religious innovation, these Puritans just cannot stand it. They want these reforms to make it more, make it more truly Protestant, the true religion. And a lot of these Puritans, this is a little connection to our history here in America, a lot of these Puritans separate from the Church of England, and being a separatist was punishable by law. So they fled to America and started colonies, right? Like we said earlier. Mm-hmm. So Charles calls Parliament, and he wants to get a little bit of money, and he calls Parliament, and Parliament starts complaining, and he's like, I'm the king. What's going on here, right? And so he dissolves Parliament, and he kind of flees. Well, actually, I'm going to talk about the Duke of Buckingham here real quick.
Yeah, because he was a good friend of Charles.
Right. And so Charles actually wants to send the Duke of Buckingham to save the Huguenots, right? And the Huguenots were a French Protestant minority.
Right. I think we've talked about them briefly in the past.
And so he was like, hey, I really am a defender of the true Protestant religion. Mm-hmm. But Parliament does not like the Duke of Buckingham. They think he has too much of like a monopoly on royal patronage. And Parliament wants to impeach him. And King Charles just wanted to call Parliament to get some money to, go save the Huguenots. And so Parliament gets upset and they're going to impeach the Duke of Buckingham. Luckily, the king has this thing in his back pocket, which is called the dissolution of Parliament. So he dissolves Parliament. Yep. He does not like this pressure.
I want to say really quick about the Duke of Buckingham, because the Duke of Buckingham and his relationship to the kings are really interesting, not just because he is always seems to find himself at the head of these like highly unpopular military expeditions. But why did that happen? Well, he was actually in he had like a weird relationship, what we would maybe consider a weird relationship with the king. They were possibly lovers. We don't really know. This is with King James still.
Oh, man.
And he actually was also a friend of his son, King Charles. So it was a whole thing.
You can't just drop this possibly lovers line with no evidence.
Okay. So at one point, the Duke of Buckingham wrote to King James in a response to something that he had written to him. He says, I naturally so love your person and adore all your other parts, which are more than ever one man had. I desire only to live in the world for your sake, and I will live and die a lover of you.
Oh, all right. I'll see.
Debatable.
I mean, there is deference to the king, right? He is the divinely appointed sovereign. I admit all of your parts. All right. Eyebrow. Half-cocked eyebrow.
Let me read you another quote.
Okay.
So he writes to him many years later, and he says, whether you loved me now better than the time which I shall never forget at Farnham, where the bed's head could not be found between the master and his dog.
All right. Half-cocked eyebrow. I have like a three-quarters cocked eyebrow now. Right.
There's also a bunch of speculation from the court that was around them at the time, but we don't want to.
There's always court speculation. You'll find this with every monarch.
But another gay icon in history.
Right. The Duke of Buckingham. And so Charles does not like this pressure. He does not like these complaints against his own person. He does not like these complaints against the Duke of Buckingham. These complaints were, again, largely on religious bounds and such, or just maybe Parliament trying to grab a little more power, right? Why not? And so he dissolves Parliament for 11 years. That's quite a long time to not have a Parliament.
And he rules as an absolute dictator, essentially, absolute monarch of the country. Makes all the decisions on his own.
Right. Unfortunately, the thing about ruling without Parliament is, like we said earlier, Parliament can levy taxes. How is he going to get the money? So immediately he dips out of the 30 Years' War, writes a separate peace, and then he's got to get creative with taxation. He's got to keep his kingdom afloat somehow. He very studiously tries to avoid war at all costs because he realizes that war is quite pricey. And so he gets creative with taxation. He tries to do this ship money scheme where he like taxes the Navy. I couldn't really it's like one of those like in American history growing up. It's like the king taxed tea. It was like, I don't know, some silly naval tax.
But it's difficult for a person who can't levy taxes. He still collects the taxes regularly, the ones that were before. But, economically nowadays, if there's any econ majors listening, you'll know that you can't really deal with stuff like that without having active control over the tax policy, because things change, expenses rise, they fall. So definitely not possible. So eventually he does have to deal with the parliament.
Right. But I'm going to get into that in a second. Mm-hmm. The ship money is very unpopular. There's this Hampton fellow who very publicly makes a stand against this. This is like an unfair taxation. He comes into our story later.
Yep.
Now, in this 11 years, he rules autocratically, generally tries to avoid war, tries to find creative taxation. But he's still kind of on his whole religious innovation grind, shall we say. And this is where kind of Scotland comes into the picture, because Scotland, like we said, had this Presbyterian tradition by John Knox. And Charles wants to impose this Book of Common Prayer onto Scotland. Now, the Book of Common Prayer, still in use by Anglican churches today, is this book that kind of prescribes the whole congregation's prayer practices. Even, I believe it has some liturgical use. I'm not sure. Maybe some people can correct me on that. But the Book of Common Prayer largely shapes the conduct of religious institutions. It largely shapes how people get together, pray, and worship, right? The Scots hate this. I mean, they hate this.
This is an attempt to unify, impose uniformity.
Right. And the Scots, have this Calvinist Presbyterian tradition, and King Charles is trying to impose this high church, I'm not going to say Anglo-Catholic. That's like a very far high church thing, but it's got a whiff of the old stuff. And these guys are the most anti-Catholic of anti-Catholics, right? And they do not like this. So the king's like, all right, let's meet. Let's talk this through. And they meet, they have this council, and they say, all right, we're not doing this. And the king's like, what? And then they say, also, we're not going to have this whole Episcopal hierarchy that we have over here, because that was imposed on Scotland, was this Episcopal hierarchy, and they were Presbyterians. I was trying to emphasize that word.
Presbyter, yep.
And they sat and they just went all the way, stripping out everything King Charles had done. And King Charles was like, stop it. But they sit for 3 more weeks.
They tried to dissolve them.
Yeah, he tried to dissolve them. They sat for 3 more weeks. And this is, every observer knows this is treason. Yep. This is considered treason, right?
When you're not listening to the king's direct order, when he's the absolute monarch, that's a hangable offense then.
Right. So, and King Charles really is about this Book of Common Prayer. So they meet, they dissolve, and they're attempted to be dissolved. They meet for 3 more weeks, and then they go home. And I believe this was in the fall. And I think people realize this high treason, come spring, there's going to be a war.
You're right.
Right?
And these guys are known as Covenanters.
Because they passed around a little covenant.
Right.
They made Scotsmen sign it, like every Scotsman sign it.
Yeah.
And most Scotsmen were on board. Of course, this is a very communitarian time of religion, where if you weren't going to church, people would be knocking on your door.
Right.
So if you weren't upholding the only true religion in all of Christendom, Scottish Presbyterianism, then they're going to knock on your door and say, hey, you got to sign this. So almost, I don't want to say like all of Scotland signed it, but there's it's like a comically huge document with signatures of like everybody,
right.
I'm assuming they could write.
And a lot of the people that were involved in this covenant movement, and later on, obviously, Andy has mentioned that it smells like war at this point. And a lot of people who are involved in all of this are actually going to be coming back in our Jacobite episode.
Right.
Because the great Montrose and like Bonnie Dundee, these guys all trace their sort of beginning of their military escapades to this sort of time, right?
Yeah.
So they will be back.
Right. And these Scots are feverish. They're willing to shed blood over this. I mean, they're organizing this feverish army that are defending this Presbyterian religion. The king's like, musters his forces. He's like, let's go defend this Book of Common Prayer religious innovation. And people are like, yeah. So you have this feverish Scottish army, and you have this group of kind of ragtag, call to arms people that they don't really.
They just don't really care.
Right. And think about wars, they cost money, right? So there's this war going on. I'm not sure if Parliament is called before or after the fighting actually starts.
Right, because the Scots invade a significant portion of northern England at this time.
Right.
They just come in and they basically unopposed just advance further and further south. And Charles gets panicked.
Yeah. Right. And so Scotland, feverish warriors, they fend them off. And they, like you said, occupy Northern Ireland, get down and down.
Northern England.
Yeah. Northern England, correct. And Charles has to call a parliament to fund this war. And I'm not sure on the chronology of whether this was called right before the fighting or right after the fighting started. But he calls this parliament because he's got to raise funds. He hates doing this, but he's got to raise funds. And when they call parliament, they're all complaining against the king times two, like last time. He does not like this. This is John Pym.
John Pym is the leader of the opposition at this point.
Of the opposition.
And I will say this, actually, a character that's going to become important soon, Cromwell, he actually was in Parliament 11 years ago.
Really?
Yeah, but he was well known. He became well known as like this like rabble rouser and like sort of an important part of the opposition. But when the Parliament was dissolved by Charles back 11 years ago, he was sort of sent back, and he didn't do very well in civilian life.
Yeah.
And so he ended up being like a small holding farmer.
Yeah.
But when the Parliament comes back, he is again sort of John Pym's sort of supporter at this point, because John Pym, leader of the opposition. Now, Cromwell was not held in particularly high regard by John Pym. He was not like brought to the fore at all. But just be aware that he is sort of puttering around the area right now.
Right.
He's sort of around already at this point, sort of getting involved in parliamentary actions and working politically.
Yep. Charles calls Parliament. They are all complaining. They don't like ship money. They don't like all this religious innovation, and they don't want a war with Scotland. They see this as like a silly thing to wage war over. And so Charles is like, well, you know what? I'll just dissolve you. And it's dissolved. So this parliament only lasted 3 weeks. It's called the Short Parliament.
Short Parliament, right.
Quickly loses the war with Scotland, as we said. Scotland's in northern England, and they start advancing. He's like, oh, no. And Scotland is like, we'll stop advancing if you pay us 850 pounds a day.
Yeah. So huge reparations. Not even reparations, but like a bribe.
Tribute.
Tribute, exactly. Like a tributary kingdom at this point.
And this is really biting his coffers. He's already like completely broke. This is really biting his coffers now.
I'm sure the English barons are like, well, your ancestors are kings of Scotland. What the heck is going on here?
Right. And at this point in this Bishop's War, there's a figure here that will be important. Wentworth, Earl of Strafford, he actually managed to raise quite a good bit of money in Ireland. So the king calls him over to Scotland. If I'm not mistaken, he was relatively well regarded by the Irish. He did a lot of positive political work for the king with the Irish. So the king's like, hey, you raised money. You kind of got them on my good side. I'm going to send you to Scotland where they hate me. Not as much luck there, not as much success. So Charles is kind of eking on money out. So let's get another parliament called. He hates this, right? But he's got to call them.
He just dissolved the short parliament.
Right. I believe this long parliament was met like a few months later. I'm not sure of the exact chronology. And
by the way, dissolved and called parliament, get used to that. That happens a lot.
Yes.
There's a lot of dissolving and calling and like this history is full of that. There's going to be a lot of parliaments here.
Right.
Try to keep them all straight.
Long parliament meets. Oh, I spoiled myself. This new parliament meets. Immediately they're complaining, and immediately they put a few acts into motion. One, hey, we got to meet every 3 years, even if you don't like it.
So basically, they take away the king's power to call Parliament.
Well, he can still call, but they're saying
they'll meet anyway.
Yeah, they'll meet anyway in 3 years.
So, but the important thing is they start to like chip away at the king's power. They don't like the fact that they could be dissolved essentially at any time at whim. So they start chipping away at this.
Chipping away at that too. And this every 3 years, even if not called. Oh yeah, and they can't be dissolved, like you said. I was reading through my outline.
Yeah.
And this act, King Charles doesn't like it, but he's like, fine. He signs on to it. He's not really in a position to be as uncompromising as he had been in the past. And then they're like, Also, we want to kill Wentworth. And he's like, what record scratch? What's going on?
Right. How did I find myself in this situation?
Right.
Says Wentworth.
Right, And this Earl of Strafford was very unpopular amongst the parliamentarians.
Because he was probably because he was so successful.
Right.
Because he was such a good royalist ally to the king. And you have here regarding a conversation between Strafford himself and the king regarding
his execution.
Yeah, right. His
Strafford's like, let me be killed, right?
Yeah.
So maybe making himself a bit of a martyr. But at this point, tensions are pretty high between Parliament and the king, and people kind of start to smell war in the air. There's already this war with Scotland. People are kind of start to smell a lot of tension with between the king and Parliament, or the royalists in Parliament, king and his supporters in Parliament. Let's say that. Strafford is like, let me be killed. Let's stop this coming war. So King Charles reluctantly signs on to Strafford being killed. And another thing that was attempted to try to stymie this upcoming war was this protestation, which is a bit of like a compromise contract that all England had to sign. And it had a bunch of parliamentary demands in it, but again, or parliamentary addendums. But again, this protestation, in order to kind of throw the king some bones, said, also, if you want to hold public service, you must pledge like absolute allegiance, loyalty to the king, right? So this is supposed to kind of make both sides happy. We know how compromises go in history. This is a theme in history.
Everybody hates the moderates.
Right. And Charles just hates all this. Pym is really getting very uppity. So you know what? Let's arrest some people. So Charles goes into Parliament with 400 soldiers and announces that he's taken 5 people. He's arresting 5 people for high treason, which is executable offense, right? And among these people, of course, was John Pym. How convenient, leader of the majority. Oh, and Hampden, who was from our Ship Money episode. He was very much against the king on kind of that material side, right? So he comes in, and these 5 people are gone because they know ahead of time. And he looks around, he says, where are they? And then Lenthal, who is kind of a leader of the opposition, says, quote, I have neither eyes to see nor tongue to speak in this place, but as this house is pleased to direct me. The king, divinely appointed king, just asked him where these refugees are, and he just pledged his loyalty to Parliament.
He defers authority to Parliament.
Parliament over the king.
It's a big deal.
In public, in Parliament.
Yeah.
And the king kind of has a funny little response here. The attribution, I like to think this is a very correct attribution. And the king says, "'Tis no matter, I think my eyes are as good as another." And then he studied the benches for a while, and then he said, "All my birds have flown." Then he left out, and as he left the Parliament, there's this crowd shouting privilege, 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 right? So
wow, huh?
Yeah, it's not going
very topical.
Yeah, it's not going so well, and he kind of feels the heat on him and his family. Yeah. So he kind of flees for the North Country and now communicates to Parliament by letter. Parliament, realizing what kind of upper hand they have, they're not giving in to any of his compromises. So people smell that there might have to be a bit more of a military conflict at this point. And this war is coming. People think that the war is coming one way or another. And towns kind of declare allegiance one side or another, right? Like you would go to a town, some rural areas might pledge support for King Charles, as was the trend, and cities tended to go for the parliamentarians.
Right, yeah. And we see throughout history that cities are far more we can call it progressive. Correct. Along the line of political sort of a direction. And that starts like in Germany, like burghers, burghers as in B-U-R-G-H-E-R. They're city people. And honestly, most of this political stuff always starts in the cities.
Right.
With the rural sort of majorities declaring for the traditional leaders.
Correct.
And that holds true here as well. And people realize now there's going to be a big war.
Yes.
There's going to be a big war. Towns are declaring, barons are declaring for one side or the other. Mostly, obviously, the landed gentry are going to want to stick with what they have. But on both sides, there are landed gentry.
Right.
And it really is coming to a head now. Huge armies. To get into it. Huge
armies are amassed here. And it's kind of just like, kind of waiting to bump into each other. They're not actively seeking each other out. Then they have a quick skirmish near Now I hate British horses. Worcestershire. Okay. And the Royalists win this battle, and the Royalists actually kind of have the upper hand for the.
The Royalists are known as the Cavaliers to history.
Right.
And one of the reasons for this is because their cavalry was tremendous against the Roundheads, who were the parliamentary forces. Now, why is this? Well, traditionally, cavalry is the domain of the rich, because you have to buy your own horse to be a cavalryman, and you basically just have to walk around with a spear to be an infantry person. So they have this tremendous cavalry. And this is where Cromwell starts to appear on the pages of history in large print, because Cromwell, he sees this event in Worcestershire. I don't know, Worcestershire, I think. Anyway, point is, he sees like these victories by the Royalists, by the Cavaliers, and he's like, okay, well, how can we replicate this? So he actually brings together a crowd of cavalry of his own, and becomes extremely well known for. And actually, this cavalry eventually defeats the Royalist cavalry. We're getting a bit ahead of ourselves here, but they prove to be extremely good at what they do. And Cromwell is at the head of this, and this is sort of where his political power starts to grow and grow and grow.
Right. And originally, like the cavalrymen they gave him, he was like, "Oh, this sucks," and he produced his own. And his soldiers were they had a reputation for being very well trained, very well disciplined. He was kind of a power of God kind of guy. He wanted all these soldiers in his army rather than going with this old aristocratic, officer elevation. He often liked to take people that were not of noble origin, or maybe low-level nobles, and say, "Hey, you're a Puritan, right? Like you're fighting for the truth.
How devout are you? How strong is your belief?" And this produced an extremely highly disciplined group of people.
Right.
And Cromwell is known as Ironsides at this point.
Old Ironsides.
Yes. And his the cavalry that he has is also sort of sometimes known as the Ironsides, sometimes in history. Now, interesting sort of point for those of you who are interested in military history, they mainly did very, very close gallop. So when they charged, they would stay very, very close together, which is not always how cavalry behaves on the field, especially during this era. Yeah. But they were able to very quickly respond and move around the battlefield and attack the points where the enemy was weakest. And this actually just made them, it was just this innovation that seems obvious to us now, but back then it was like this huge deal.
Right.
It was this genius tactic.
Again, you see this with wars, the forward-thinking ones, people that anticipate future like military strategies, the people that innovate them. Maybe they're taking more risks, but they tend to come out on top. And again, maybe this is just an afterthought, but maybe this is why history typically a lot of the times the more like I don't want to say like conservative faction, but like the incumbent faction does not always win, because the incumbent faction is less willing to risk it.
It's mired in tradition.
Right. It's less willing to risk it, whereas these newcomers are willing to take some risks, and maybe they'll get squashed, but sometimes you'll hit on a really good military innovation, and then, the world is yours. Yep. And Cromwell has an interesting quote about this training of these cavalrymen, and he says, this is in a letter to one of the other officers. Oh, this is to Hampton, actually, the ship money man. "Your troopers are most of them old, decaying serving men and tapsters. And referring to the Royalists, troopers are gentlemen's sons, younger sons and persons of quality. Do you think that the spirits of such base and mean fellows such as ours will ever be able to encounter gentlemen that have honor and courage and resolution in them?" So not only does he have this military innovation of being well trained, he also has a bit of an ethical bent to his I almost said cavaliers, to his cavalrymen, right? Mm-hmm. He was a puritanical radical. He sought to make disciplined soldiers by the power of Protestantism. And he actually gave each soldier a little Bible. And this Bible was 16 pages long, 150 verse quotations. Yep. And I think it's like 148 of them are all from OT, right? Old Testament. Yeah. And it's like all a soldier needs for battle. And
it's just like to behead your enemies. Mao's little red book in the 1600s.
Literally, yeah.
It's a thing.
Yeah.
And it's a thing that happens.
Right.
You got to get these soldiers in an ideological bent with you, and then they'll fight harder.
Right. And this little book is interesting because it has quotations in it from Cromwell himself above the verses. And it's like, you shall love your enemies in as much as they are your enemies, but hate them in as much as they are enemies of God.
Yeah.
And Cromwell believed he was fighting the enemies of God. You know, he was not a charlatan. He really did believe.
No, he if anything, you're going to take away from this whole Cromwell stuff and Cromwell as a person, I think a lot of times he's reviled and maybe, you know, it's justified.
If you're Irish,
well, if you're Irish especially, but English as well, you know, he's reviled with justification. But the thing about Cromwell that is very, very important is that he is not a guy who is in it for his own power. He is not in it for his own gain. He is totally devoted to his idea of what a kingdom of God on earth should be.
Well, ultimately, I will say that in saying that, Anton, you are kind of going against a bit of mainstream scholarship regarding him at this point. Not at this point, obviously, but mainstream scholarship, because Winston Churchill called him a military dictator. He was definitely perceived in mainstream English history as someone who used the military to seek power for his own gain. But
Churchill also tried to name a cruiser after him and was actually not against him. And Churchill was actually argued down from this position because at that time, obviously, the Irish Rebellion was starting, and they were like, we cannot name a cruiser after Cromwell at this point in history. So yes, historically.
Oh, the Cromwell tanks in World War II.
Right.
Girls in Panzer.
Yeah, well, and by the way, that's all Churchill, right?
Yeah,
that's all like Churchill's influence. Cromwell was reviled. You're right. Historical sort of judgment of Cromwell was very, very intense for a very long time.
Right,
because the kings were in power. And the descendants of those kings obviously did not like them. Did not like Cromwell.
Right.
But Cromwell, I think, is you really is not like dressing in gold chains and stuff out on the street. This is a guy who's always very modest.
Right.
His entire life, he dressed very modestly. Yep. He lived very modestly.
Right.
He refused power.
Right.
At every turn, he refused power. So I don't know. If history really considers him to be a very one-sided character, I think that's wrong. I think that's something that we need to be arguing against. You know?
I got to use station ID real quick.
No worries, go ahead.
91.9 FM Houghton. Okay. And Cromwell is interesting, and I imagine we're going to talk about him a little more regarding his end and perhaps his interregnum, but this is how Cromwell comes onto the scene and starts to get influence here, right? Like we said, he did have a bit of a voice. He was kind of a rabble-rouser in these former parliaments, but where did he really make his name? That was, his Ironside troops. And these Ironside troops were pretty stout Puritans. He really did seek to cultivate an army of these Puritans, and they were known for being actually quite ethical with regards to, well, when I say quite ethical, I'm not talking about Ireland or anything. What I'm saying is, when this Civil War happened, people were worried about both sides coming in, raping and pillaging and burning towns to the ground. And there's actually these club men that formed in these towns that were neutral, and they wanted to protect the towns from all these. They usually got ran over, but the fear of, these traditional rape and pillage as spoils of war was very much...
Because at the time, that was not a thing that, like nowadays we think Geneva Convention, right? Like, the war is not fought that way.
Right.
Back then, that was like, not only practice, but common practice. That's the way that they maintained.
That fear was common enough for these independent societies.
How do you feed these armies?
Right.
How do you, keep the men from going crazy? Just let them loose on a town. They'll rob everything. They'll pillage everything. They'll, bunch of sex assaults. That was very common.
Yeah. Cromwell takes a different approach, and his Ironsides, they were not ones to rape and pillage, So that is an interesting thing to note about this in time.
And importantly, I think we don't really try to impart a bias or anything like that in our work here with Science of History. But I will say that is that's objectively a credit to Cromwell.
Right. And I think we'll talk later on about maybe why Cromwell, maybe more of the negative side, or
we'll get into the atrocities and all of that,
right. But this is Cromwell as he stands as this up and coming military officer. Now, Parliament is starting to lose the war at the beginning, but then these Ironsides start taking stuff back. The Duke of Essex, who was kind of the big bad at this time before the real army was formed. The Duke of Essex was kind of the big baddie of the royalists, or shall we say the Cavaliers at this point, because he was basically like the leader of this whole parliamentary effort. And he kind of goads Charles into doing the siege of Gloucester. Gloucester. Okay. Gloucester. So he diverts all his troops there and then pounces on the rest of the troops at Newbury, totally wins, and he returns to London triumphant. And this was a big deal because the royalist strategy at this time was to march straight to London and hope to run into the Duke of Essex, whereas the Duke of Essex kind of routed them in this manner. And this is a pretty big deal. And so at this point, they start to try to these Englishmen start to try to see what allies they can pull. And a lot of the times these civil wars are known as, along with various other wars with them, known as the War of Three Kingdoms. Mm-hmm. And this is where we see that. Charles maneuvers to peace with Ireland, which had been in turmoil for a while. He maneuvers to peace with them and says, hey, help me out here. Whereas the parliamentarians get the Scots to their side because the Scots hate the king.
Scots hate the king.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And Parliament wins York with the Scots, with the assistance of the Scots. And then they also form this new army. This is called the New Model Army. At the head, Thomas Fairfax, and by his right-hand side, Oliver Cromwell.
Right. Oliver Cromwell, at this point, now we already discussed how he was beginning to make a name for himself. Now he is very, very much associated with the faction that he will end up leading,
right.
The New Model Army.
Right. And
Fairfax is an important character as well.
Right.
We need to remember Fairfax because he is very interesting as well. I believe that we'll talk about him later, but I'm not sure how much we will.
Fairfax?
Yeah.
I don't have much on my outline. Maybe you can speak to him.
Yeah,
I don't know much.
I can talk a little bit about him later.
So Parliament reforms this model army, and they start really crushing Charles. Charles just has this ragtag team of royalists, whereas the Roundheads, which is the parliamentary army, was crushing it with Cromwell, this like magnificent commander, and these well-disciplined troops. Numbers, Parliament at this time had control of London. I mean, from the beginning, Parliament had London. So Charles kind of gets screwed here. And so he just starts to chill with the Scottish Presbyterians. He's like, he takes refuge in the Scottish Presbyterian army.
It was just like, what? Why?
There's an interesting quote from one of the soldiers here. And I quote, "The king came into our army yesterday in so private a way that after we had made search for him upon the surmises of some persons who pretended to know his face, yet we could not find him out in sundry houses. And we believe your lordships will think it was a matter of much astonishment to us, seeing we did not expect that he would come into have any place in our power." Because
even they were incredulous.
They're like, what?
Yeah. Like, why would the king come and bunk with people that he had, spent the last 10 years
really
fighting against and oppressing, right?
Right. And so they're like, all right, go to prison.
Yep.
So they hand him over to the Roundheads. Yep. He's in prison. And that is the end of the first English Civil War. There's this bit of an interbellum here.
Yeah. And the second one is a damp squib, but the first one is really the one that people talk about.
Right. And we are papering over a lot of the military strategy. This was a very military innovative war. Like we said, we did talk about the cavalry under Cromwell. Mm-hmm. I would encourage listeners to look at on YouTube. There are still reenactment societies.
Oh, yeah.
And they're pretty awesome.
Yeah, they're very cool.
They're pretty awesome.
Cool. And this is like probably the English war for reenactment.
Correct.
Right? Because it's all English. It's all like very historically relevant to them.
Like we do Civil War reenactments in America.
Right. And we should talk about a little bit about Tom Fairfax here, I think, because he was actually the leader of the Roundheads. He was known as Black Tom Fairfax. And he was a very capable commander. He actually fought for the king for a period of time, but obviously he ended up leading the Roundhead army. Now, and he actually was probably the person who won the Battle of Naseby, which is the big battle in which the Roundheads finally trounced the Cavaliers.
Right.
He is a really interesting person because he actually, and this is getting a bit of ahead of ourselves, but he actually gets disillusioned with Cromwell pretty early on and just like washes his hands of everything and retires into the countryside. And when, spoiler alert, Cromwell dies and England becomes a monarchy again, he was actually not killed, and he was not dishonored at all, because the royalists respected him and his honor on the battlefield and everything else. You will note that most of the leaders of the parliamentarians, after the restoration of the monarchy, they were put to death, or something else was done to their bodies, which we'll get into it. Yeah. But it was not the case with Fairfax. He was very much respected by both sides. So a very rare person.
Right. And you have this kind of interbellum. The king's in prison, but even like the king's staunchest enemies were like, well, he's the king, right? You can't just, what are you going to do with the king? We're still going to need him for our new rule. So they're still trying to figure stuff out. And there's these kind of three factions that arise in this power vacuum: the royalists, and then we have the model army, and then we have the Presbyterians, right? And Charles is kind of he's a sneaky little boy. He
shows more acumen at this point, I think, historically, than he had at any point in his previous reign as king. He was playing all the sides against each other. He was definitely obviously aligned more with the royalists. Obviously he doesn't in the end. But he's aligned with the royalists, but he sees this like model army faction with Cromwell and Fairfax, and he sees the Presbyterians and he says, well, these guys are not actually on the same team, right? They're not. The Presbyterians have their own faith. The puritanical New Model Army has their faith, and they're not really compatible. They've proved themselves not to be compatible in the past. And so he knows that there's going to be divisions here.
Right, and he really does play each side, and this eventually kind of culminates with this is a good little move of political acumen on Charles's part. Could he have, if he displayed this earlier, could he have avoided some unfortunate 100,000 death plus civil wars? Maybe.
Maybe. Yeah.
Right. He actually gets the Scots on his side. Like, the Scots we were talking about earlier, he promises them autonomy, let's abolish the Episcopal. You guys can do whatever you want with your church. If you kind of invade England, let's
get
work
me back, save me, please.
Let's work together.
Help.
And again, he does come from a Scottish line, right? So it's not entirely crazy, even though he spent the last, 11 years of personal rule completely.
Which is really interesting, because when we look at it from a Jacobite context later on when we do that episode, we'll see like these Stuarts they are Scottish. The Scottish people support the Stuarts. They love the Stuarts. They're like this integral part of Scotland. And then not like even like 2 generations earlier, there's this like the Scots hate the king. They hate the Stuarts. So it's just really kind of an interesting thing. Stuart, by the way, kind of a little side note for those who are interested. Stuart comes from the word steward.
Oh, really?
Because they were the stewards of the king of the throne of Scotland for a while.
Interesting. Yeah.
But anyway, Stuart.
Right. And also Parliament, which has formed this new model army, is like, well, you guys your job's done. We can dissolve you. And the army at this point had kind of taken on a life of its own, right?
Yeah, they became like a thinking, breathing monstrosity, really.
Right. And, Parliament's kind of dealing with a Frankenstein monster of its own creation of these.
Led by Cromwell.
Yeah, right.
Old Ironsides.
Right.
He's coming.
And the army is like, you know what? We're fighting another war. And I'm going to really paper over the Second English Civil War. If you're interested in military stuff, maybe there's some cool stuff. In my preparation for this episode, I really didn't look into it. I read the summaries, and it was like the army gets, they get peeved off. Let's fight another war. Charles gets the Scots to invade, and then the royalists get squashed. And
it was just really unorganized. Like I said earlier, it was a damp squib. There was not a lot of organization for it. And most of the armies didn't really even coalesce. For the royalists. So
and also interesting is the royalists in part 1 of the Civil War. After the Civil War, they made a promise to Parliament that they were not to bear arms. So the royalists that did bear arms here were not treated very kindly after they lost a battle. So they lose. I'm kind of papering over the whole Second Civil War.
Yeah.
And the army now...
Not historically that important, in my opinion.
Right. And the army now hates Charles because they see him as this kind of conniving little fellow.
Yeah, because he's fomented another war.
Right. And they hate that Parliament still sees him as useful, because even after the Second War, there's like a vote on whether or not to still work with the king. Basically, that's what the act was. And it was actually in favor of, let's still work with the king, even though the army was like, wait, this guy just, totally, this guy just totally screwed everything up, So they do a little purge. They do a little military coup d'etat called the Pride Purge. Thomas Pride.
Pride's Purge, yeah.
Pride's Purge, right.
Pride's Purge, where the army just marches into the parliament and just necks everybody who was against them.
Right. Did they, this is one thing, did they kill people or did they just kick them out?
They kicked them out.
Okay,
but, a lot of them did end up dying.
In unfortunate circumstances. And they kind of took all the people out who were seen as still different to the king.
Yep.
And so they basically made this, they purified Parliament.
Yeah, they basically
purified.
Puritan. They took out all the parts of Parliament that were still sort of friendly to the king.
Right.
And they made it into a body that was essentially anti-royalist.
Right.
We can maybe call them Republican at this point.
Right.
The term Republican is a little sneaky because it's not really a Republican government or anything like that.
Yeah.
We're getting ahead of ourselves because that's what the French sort of revolution sort of pioneered. But yeah, these guys are anti-monarchists. They are pretty strong. At least they're coalesced into this anti-monarchy
Puritan body.
And this is what leads to the capacity of Parliament to actually rule against the king.
Right, and try the king, interestingly enough. And they tried the king for treason.
Right. And the trial of the king is a really interesting part of English history. For those who are interested listeners, I can recommend a YouTube channel called Historia Civilis. He has a really great sort of in-depth look at the trial of King Charles, because the question was, how do you try somebody from whom all the laws stem?
Divine right. Yeah.
All the laws stem from this king in our governmental policy. So these guys, the parliamentary anti-monarchists, they had to really, really try very, very hard to find a legal proceeding in which they could skirt the law and say, okay, well, the king has committed crimes against his people. And the king said, for a couple days, I think, he just didn't say anything. And then he said, by what authority? And that was his big thing. By what authority do you judge me?
Right.
And nobody can answer that question.
Right.
He wouldn't plead guilty or innocent, but he would say, by what authority do you judge me?
Right, and that's a very real question. I mean, today we kind of have these like modern minds of like, 200 years of equal access democracy.
Right. By the authority of Congress or the Supreme Court or some sort of body that is separate from a person. But back then, all the laws stemmed from the monarch.
And you kind of have this like social imaginary of, and this was kind of starting to lift at the time, especially after like the Reformation, but you had this social imaginary, which is the king is in contact with God. He's like this divine ruler, and then he's in contact with the various bishops and advisors, like this hierarchy. That's how you related to the system. It wasn't as we have today where everybody, relates to the governmental system through like a vote. It was this like kind of Platonic hierarchy, and that's how people perceived it. So this, on what authority, maybe to our modern minds, it might seem silly. To, if you kind of put yourself in kind of the social imaginary of, Englishmen in the 1600s, they're like, what is going on? Like, what is it? How does this,
I really recommend that you check out, if you're interested in all of this legalism, I do recommend that you check out that video.
I'm going to check it out.
We might set a link or something on the YouTube version
I'll
of this.
put it in the description.
But,
see, Anton uploads that, so he's actually, by doing this in public, he's like forcing me to. He's this is abusing his seat of power.
I'm just saying that it's a good. I'm just saying.
I upload the videos, Bucko.
Yeah, that's true. It's all Andy on that side of things. But anyway, so definitely really interesting, and it's important to note that even in this trial run by enemies of the king, people were frightened by this idea of breaking down these barriers. They're terrified, and these are like hardline dudes.
Yeah,
and they're like, oh shoot, is this the right thing to do?
Yeah. But Cromwell is this is where Cromwell kind of really starts to make his mark on history.
Yeah.
Obviously, he was a great military commander, but it's entirely possible that he would have just been remembered as a great military commander. Right here, Cromwell really pushes for the execution of the team. He might even be said to be the author of the king's execution.
And when the vote happens, nobody wants to, obviously they vote in favor of executing the king for treason.
Right.
But nobody wants to sign the death order.
Right.
And everybody's like scared of this
Fairfax shrewdly did not.
Yeah. Fairfax actually leaves at this point. So we mentioned how he left and he sort of broke with Cromwell. This is when it happens. Fairfax just retires from the whole farce.
Right.
But the death order is brought to Cromwell, and Cromwell just signs it. He doesn't care.
He doesn't care.
He signs it like it's nothing, and he throws it away, and he says, do it. Get it done.
Right.
Cromwell had no fear of breaking down these barriers. He had no compunction whatsoever. Cromwell at this point already started to believe that he was a divine instrument.
Right.
A sort of a chosen by God figure that was going to purify England.
And he believed that his battlefield victories was God saying, good job, Oliver.
Good job, Oliver.
And then his defeats were like, try again, Oliver. Try something different. This wasn't my will for you, Oliver. Right.
Yeah. So like trope of a guy who, thinks that he's God's instrument. Cromwell was no joke one of these guys.
Yeah, he was an interesting character. In fact, there's a quote attributed to him where he said he's like, I hope to render the English name as great and formidable as the Roman ever was. This is a quote attributed to him. Maybe this is due to, like you said, this whole retrospective, casting of Cromwell. But
you also, I would say, I think that is very likely his quote.
Right.
But think about it. What is the Roman Empire to modern legalists? It is an example of an empire that had a legal tradition that was enshrined by law and was very heavily respected.
Obviously, and was glorious. I mean, we still in Western culture, like Rome is still like the empire, right?
And even with the emperors, there was a very strong legal sort of underpinning that, in my opinion, is what actually made Rome great. It wasn't really even the military battles, but obviously those expanded it. But what made Rome succeed and become a historical like cornerstone is actually their legal tradition.
Right. Law of the 12 tables, something or other.
Well, something like that, But just everything. But all of our law codes come from the Justinian Code. Right. Or like even prior codes. Yeah. It's all from Roman law.
Right.
That's why we have like statues of justice on our courthouses and things like that.
Or why there's Latin in the courthouse.
Why there's always Latin there. It's all from Roman.
Right.
And I think that Cromwell knew and respected that.
Right.
And I think that if he had said that, we're not sure, but if he had said that, I think that he would have been saying it from that.
And in England, when while we're on the topic of legalism, England really has this strong tradition of rule of law. Obviously, sometimes when they get a little frustrated, they might do horrible executions of.
Pretty commonly.
Right.
Actually, I mean, Britain. As we were discussing this earlier in the booth, but Britain has a history of just horrific executions. Drawing and quartering was one of their favorites. They would like put somebody on a rack and then.
And we're not saying this is like a quality unique to British people. These are barbaric times in general.
No, they are barbaric times, but it's interesting to see the dichotomy and the sort of juxtaposition of this legalist attitude, and then these horrific punishments. Of course, Rome had that too. Crucifixion. Like they would have these legal things. They would have very strict laws. And then they would just like brutalize anybody who opposed them. That was the case in England as well.
And England, the English people have this tradition of very much respect for this rule of law. So again, killing the divinely appointed king really is scary, right?
Right. And when this actually happened, Charles, knowing that he was going to be killed, he specifically played up the martyrdom fact.
Right.
He specifically played up. He wore like a white shirt.
Yep. And he wanted to wear that extra white shirt so he wouldn't shiver. Out of the cold because he didn't want to be perceived as a coward.
Yeah. Exactly. And so he went with very. He knew it was going to happen, and he was very keen to make it play in a way that would be.
And the gospel for that day. So in liturgical tradition, obviously. in Anglican tradition, which stems from the Catholic tradition, there's specific Bible passages that you read on specific days. And the day of his execution, the gospel reading was the crucifixion of Christ and the Gospel of Matthew. And he was like, I knew it.
Right. Very interesting coincidence there.
Right.
Yeah, for sure. And so Charles is beheaded by an executioner with an axe. And there's some debate over this because there's different stories about how it happened.
Right. And Charles, right before executing, he was planning on making this like glorious speech to all the people. And then whether intentionally or unintentionally, it's just like he realized that like the arrangement of people meant that nobody would hear him. So he was like, well, you know,
screw it.
Yeah, screw it.
Let's get this over.
To the end.
Yeah.
You got. We're objective. I got a smile.
No, I mean it's very respectable.
He had a pretty honorable death, right?
Yeah.
Or at least his approach to it. Even though he was very consciously trying to make himself a martyr, was he a martyr? In Anglican high church tradition, he's celebrated. But before we get to that, I do want to talk about the executioner of Charles is actually quite a matter of public debate.
Right, and I think that was intentional because who wants to be known
as the guy who killed
the king? As we've talked before, even in this like hardline parliament, people were not comfortable with the idea.
Right.
Except for like Cromwell and his guys. But like, who's going to be the guy who actually does it?
Right, and the only person who probably knew was Cromwell and his closest people, and that secret was kind of taken to the grave.
Right, yeah.
There was a lot of people, there was a lot of like rumors about this actually in like the century afterwards, and there was some like forged deathbed confessions, or maybe not forged. By modern scholarship, we would consider them forged. But there is some interesting facts about the executioner. This is a little grisly, but the clean cut on Charles's head, and this is, I'm quoting directly, the clean cut on Charles's head and the fact that the executioner held up his head after the execution suggests that the executioner was experienced in the use of an axe. You know, this was not Mary Queen of Scots where it was 3 strokes. This was a clean, this was a pretty skilled person.
So for context, Mary Queen of Scots that botched the execution and she was in horrific pain because they did it badly, essentially.
Right.
But obviously in this case, I think that I would imagine that Cromwell would have wanted it done quick, clean.
Right. Obviously,
it's done.
Executioner had a mask on.
Yeah, of course.
And
as is tradition.
And the executioner did not call out, as was tradition, behold the head of a traitor when he held out the head. I think he tossed the head into some like soldiers or something. I'm not sure. And so that could indicate that maybe he was inexperienced. Maybe they brought a new guy in and they didn't use the usual executioner. Or maybe I
think it's more likely
that he didn't want to be identified by his voice, right?
Exactly.
And a lot of people say the current executioner at this time, I forget his name, but on this day that he did, on this day, I said he, right? On this day that the execution of Charles occurred, he did get 30 pounds. He did receive 30 pounds. So people say it is likely that probably the usual guy must have done it. Yeah. But again, it is a bit of a mystery.
In my opinion, I think that's likely.
Right.
Yeah.
And again, Charles, after this, he definitely tried to position himself as a martyr. And in high church Anglican circles, there is a bit of a cult of Charles I, King Charles the Martyr. There was actually in Anglican church, there was a celebration of his, until the mid-1800s, there was a feast day for Charles the Martyr. I don't believe he was actually canonized, or I don't know anything about the Anglican church. I know a little bit. I know what I need to for this episode. But he did make himself a bit of a martyr. And there was a bit of, after his death, there was a bit of a propaganda war because royalists published this, and I hope I pronounce this correctly, Icon Basilique, which was this whole supposed autobiography of King Charles, meditations before his death. And it was like King Charles, I'm a martyr, meditations on scripture. The authorship of this is generally assumed to not actually have been him, but just a sympathetic person. But that didn't really matter at the time. And so, the Roundheads fire back with John Milton, actually, poet of Paradise Lost, did Iconoclasts. And this was, the king was a destroyer of the true Protestant religion. True Protestant religion, a phrase that appears quite often here. He told his only children, that he hadn't seen in 15 years the night before, to uphold the true Protestant religion, right? Which he perceived as a high church tradition. And there is a little interesting Russia fact on how Europe responded to the beheading. Most of them were like, oh, that's horrible, that's gruesome. They were caught in the 30 Years' War. They did have other things on their mind. They were unnerved, but it probably was not the primary concern. And relations with England didn't change too much, to my knowledge, again. Russia, however, Tsar Alexis broke off all diplomatic relations with England, and he accepted all like royalist refugees in Moscow again.
They probably didn't like the climate very much, but I'm sure they were happy to be safe.
Right. And he also banned English merchants from his country.
Which is insane.
Yeah, English merchants, So again, when people see, the Tsar as this, the defender of like autocracy, orthodoxy.
Yeah, the gendarme of Europe, many centuries later, but
it has a tradition.
Yeah.
And once there was the Restoration, we'll get to that in a bit. Just touch on it. That's a whole period in its own, right?
Yeah, right. We might touch on it in the Jacobite episode.
Right. There, Charles II, his eldest son, who I believe actually fled from execution in like an oak tree or something.
Yeah, well, he hid in an oak tree.
Right.
That's like that became a very common legend in British tradition that he hid in an oak tree and the Roundheads couldn't find him.
Yeah.
So there's actually, I think, a celebration.
Oak Tree Day.
Oak Tree Day, where they commemorate the day that he hid in an oak tree. Anyway.
And Charles II, once he had been restored to the throne, this was King Charles the Beheaded's eldest son, he provided a lot of financial assistance to him and to Henrietta Maria, the Catholic widow, who we might remember from the beginning of the episode. He sent his condolences to her saying, calling her the disconsolate widow of that glorious martyr, King Charles I.
So interesting words from Tsar Alexis there.
Right. I think, and so, sorry. After that, there was this interregnum. I'm not really touching on that. I'm really more interested in the character of Cromwell at this point.
Well, Cromwell, let's just go over it in brief. Cromwell becomes, sort of by virtue of being this guy who is really on it with the execution of the king, he becomes essentially the leader of the of England.
Yeah, you're in charge of all this, right?
Lord Protector of England. He becomes. He actually. So, and this is where we start to really kind of look at Cromwell as a leader rather than just like an actor in the great farce or the story of King Charles's ultimate end. Now we look at him as an individual leader of England because he does become Lord Protector. He actually convenes a couple of different parliaments. Notably, he convenes something called Barebones Parliament, where instead of having like an actual parliament that's elected, he chooses saintly people who are strong in the puritanical belief, who are very, very dedicated to the cause. Now, the first thing these guys do, and these guys are made up of like real Puritan, like fundamentalists, kind of weird guys, honestly. They're not really the people that usually would be in this position, like landed gentry. But the first thing they do is they say, okay, well, actually, we don't believe in democracy, so you should be in charge. And Cromwell does not actually like this. Cromwell did not, he tried to fight against this as much as he could. That's sort of, when I was speaking earlier about his refusal of power, that's sort of one of the instances in which this becomes relevant. He was offered to be king. He was offered to be the ultimate leader of all Britain, and he refuses at every possible moment. He does eventually accept it because nobody else will, but he essentially inherits this mess of the three kingdoms, and he has to bring them all together. Now, this is where we get into Cromwell's work in Scotland and his invasion of Ireland, which we did really sort of briefly touch upon in our Irish episode, but Cromwell becomes this Lord Protector leader of this army, and he invades Ireland and Scotland and brings them essentially under the English rule again.
They were not willing participants in this, and this is a topic for another day, but Cromwell, not very well liked in Ireland, goes to Ireland. One is they're all Catholics, and he hates this. and basically goes there.
Consider them like, quote, like wretched barbarians.
Right. And he decimates, estimates vary a lot. Always death tolls and casualties for these older events are hard to estimate, but lower bounds, he decimated 15% of the population. Upper bounds, 50, half the population.
Yeah, and I think that might be a bit steep. Just
right,
you know, but the population of Ireland is not up for debate.
Right,
like the sort of the crimes that Cromwell committed in Ireland are sort of at odds with his work in England previously. Like we were talking about how he's generally tries to wage war in a very clean and collateral way.
Yeah.
Well, in Ireland, that's off the table. He goes in there and he will burn down a town with no compunction whatsoever.
Right.
So, and that sort of is why he is so hated by the Irish, right?
Yeah.
That it's very valid.
Right.
Just, you know, to put it in brief, it's a very valid argument against Cromwell.
And like we said, with this English occupation, and this is just I'm just throwing a bit of a connection back to our Irish War of Independence episode. With this English occupation, like you said, with priests and holes in England, Catholic priests and holes in England. In Ireland, a little interesting tidbit of how to get around religious oppression is that the Irish basically all hid their priests in various ways, and how they celebrated Mass. It was they'd go out into the forest, you know, as a group of people under different premises, right? And then they would look around, you know, see like, okay, who's to my left, who's to my right? Do we know everybody here? Okay, no traitors, good. The priest, then someone would reveal the priest who was like typically hiding like behind a tree somewhere. He would come out and he would celebrate Mass on a stone altar or just like a stone they found.
Yeah.
And so this kind of really strengthens like the Irish's Catholic convictions, and obviously like the oppression of Catholics in Ireland, which was, you know, knowing Cromwell, probably very much due to like their Catholic nature. This kind of gives the tone of a lot of later Irish rebellions, of course, the Irish War of Independence that we covered last time, which again, like we said, that one was not necessarily about doctrinal differences, but it certainly started as it, and it continued to fall along those lines.
Regarding Ireland, sort of some dates, right? Because we've been sort of light on dates, I think. But
we're always pretty light on dates.
Yeah, we are.
But chronology, who cares?
The Irish episode, I think we're pretty good about it. But this is because we had such a long outline. Ireland had been lawless during all this Charles stuff.
Yeah.
They had sort of like thrown off, and there wasn't a lot of like control over Ireland at that point. But
Ireland's good at making themselves ungovernable.
Yeah, that's true, as we learned, you know, with our previous episode. But there was already an invasion force sent there in 1647. But Cromwell's invasion in 1649 was actually the one that succeeded. And they were able to, now that the Civil War in England was over, they could actually persecute the war more directly. And they were easily resupplied from England at this point because the Civil War was over, like I said. And so they were able to like set up in Dublin and Derry and other places. And they essentially occupied most of the eastern and northern parts of the country. But there were a few events, Wexford and Drogheda, which were horrific war crimes by modern standards. Cromwell, I'll read the quote again. He said, "I'm persuaded that this is a righteous judgment of God upon these barbarous wretches who have embrued their hands in so much innocent blood, that it will tend to prevent the effusion of blood for the future, which are satisfactory grounds for such actions which otherwise cannot work remorse and regret."
Oh my God.
So essentially what he's saying here is that because the Irish barbarians are so ungovernable and dangerous that it is better to kill a bunch of them and do it now without remorse and regret and be able to control Ireland.
And he was always quoting scripture in his letters, and this is something in his letters that might point to his attitude towards this, is he was very much a fan of a verse in Isaiah 8, talking about the city. Obviously in the Bible it's Jerusalem, but he talks about this as like, you know, the city of God that he is trying to create in England, this unified British kingdom. He would always quote these verses in Isaiah 8 of the city will fall and only the godly will survive, right? You know, the unrighteous will be crushed out from the hand of God. And this is really what he saw himself as doing in a lot of these foreign conquests. So,
but he was not equally oppressive to all religious groups that he did not like. The Catholics suffered the worst of the atrocities. Now, interestingly, in about 1650, the Scots, remember the Scots, they're coming back into the story, they proclaim Charles II, the son of Charles the Beheaded, as their king. And obviously, Cromwell wraps up in Ireland in 1650 and boots, like, he rushes off back to Scotland. And there's and of course, these Presbyterians that are rising in Scotland now, it used to be his allies in, the first Civil War. And he definitely was kinder to them than he was to the Irish Catholics. He considered them to be deceived. So they feared God's power, but they were deceived by like a slight, difference in Protestant ideology, right? So he fights a battle at Dunbar, Worcester, and other places, and essentially they sack a place called Dundee, kill a bunch of men, women, and children, and then they established the rule of the Commonwealth, which is what England is now called, and kept under military occupation, essentially, for the duration of the Commonwealth. Now, interestingly, the king, Charles II, was not ever, captured, as far as I'm aware. And the Scots continually rebelled against the Commonwealth. They were never really, under the boot, I guess you could say.
Correct.
There's always, and that again, that's going to play in later on with the Stuarts, the history of the Stuarts. So there's not really as much bitterness against Cromwell in Scotland as there is in Ireland. So obviously he comes back. There are a couple of different parliaments. I want to say something more about Barebones Parliament, though. We mentioned it briefly, but he established something called the Sanhedrin of saints.
Wow.
Now, those of you who are familiar with biblical history and especially Old Testament stuff, Sanhedrin is a very loaded term, and so this Barebones Parliament of saintly people, they were called a Sanhedrin by Cromwell himself. And he considered it to be a godly gathering of the kingdom of God on earth. It was a whole thing. This guy, if you haven't caught on to the fact that this guy is an absolute fundamentalist, kind of a nut. I mean,
right.
He was absolutely crazy. But so Protectorate is established that lasts from 1653 to 58. There's some colonization that happens during this time, actually, and that's, obviously Puritan influence on American colonies is very strong at this point.
Right.
That's sort of, go ahead.
I will say something about, and one of the main goals of this show is I'd like to clear up maybe misconceptions about history that you might have just growing up in the English-speaking world, especially with the schooling system. So a lot of it's drawn on my knowledge of history, growing up in the school system. And on the American Revolution, or just the history of America, you hear that the Puritans, escaped to America to escape religious persecution. And that's true, right? Like we said, they were separatists. They could be be prosecuted under law. But then you see what kind of persecution the Puritans did. And
the witch hunts in America even are a great example of that.
Right.
And actually, funny story. So the Puritans, we call them the Puritans. They did not call themselves the Puritans. Do you know what they called themselves?
I learned this right before the show and I forgot it.
They called themselves separatists.
When
they were in England. And the king was basically hey, maybe stop doing that.
Puritan was more of a...
So they leave.
The
Pilgrims, I think is what they're called in America. But they leave England. They go to the Dutch, the Netherlands, right, who are already essentially Protestants and very strong Protestants, and they're too extreme for the Dutch. So they're hey, maybe get out of here. So that only then do they actually go to America.
Right. Again, I'm not trying to cast any particular judgment. I'm just trying to, maybe do a little addendum to the history we get growing up in our schools.
Right. So I will say this. Maybe we can get to Cromwell's death, actually.
Right.
Because the end of the Protectorate is basically Cromwell's death. Because after Cromwell, things kind of went badly. Now, Cromwell probably suffered from malaria. And there's a really interesting anecdote, which I see you've noted on the on the outline, where he refused to take quinine, which is it's a main ingredient in tonic water. Some of you might not be familiar with that. It's proven to act against malaria. It helps with treatment, but he refused it. And why do you refuse it, Andy?
Because it was discovered by Jesuit missionaries, Catholic Jesuit missionaries.
And anything that's discovered by the Catholics is not good enough for Cromwell.
Satan.
So he does not take this quinine, and he is terribly sick with malaria, probably kidney stones as well. It's theorized that he died of sepsis. There's some arguments about whether or not he was assassinated. I know Andy was reading some stuff about that.
I will say, I think it is a bit of a, whenever there is a death of a figure at a historically relevant time, there is always going to be speculation. And hey, there was motive. The death was pretty quick. Like the ambassador of Venice in England wrote to the Doge of Venice saying, Doge, whatever. Wrote to the Doge of Venice saying, hey, this whole death of Cromwell seems mighty speedily. So even at the time, there was a little bit of, a suspicion. There was obviously royalist motivation for this. A lot of people say that maybe the protectorate was actually quite a strong government. Then he died, and it all fell apart under his son.
Yep.
Some people say,
who succeeded him, by the way.
Right. Some people say no, it was already failing. Cromwell's death was just kind of the capstone of it. Like I said, there is a lot of curious events that surround it. There was no candles at his funeral. There was a lot of weird changing of arrangements at his funeral. People were like, is this the real body? The palace's statement was vague, and it was interesting, I will admit. I don't think it was the case, but it's a possibility.
Right.
The motive was there.
I think the general historical, it's probably malaria.
Yeah. So he dies. He's given actually quite a royal funeral and burial, if I'm not mistaken. Given that he acted as Lord Protector in quite a royal capacity, he was buried near Elizabeth I's gravesite, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, but of course, then Restoration happens.
Restoration, basically, Britain's in all this chaos. Charles II, the eldest son of Charles the Beheaded's like, hey, if you let me back, let's work. What's the move, boys? And so Parliament's like, all right, you come back. That's the short. And so this whole thing,
this whole nightmare situation that was unfolded in Britain for the past 20 years ends with the same royal line on the throne.
It's like
same name even from the monarch.
And even historians have noted it's like basically nothing had happened.
And exactly,
it was like just folding time back into itself.
And then in exactly 12 years after the execution of Charles I, Cromwell's body is dug up.
Yes.
And they execute him ceremonially, posthumously, and send his head.
Take that.
Exactly. Well, we were talking about what happened to the people after the Restoration. A lot of them were put to death. Yeah. A lot of them were posthumously dug up and thrown into the ocean. Yeah. There was a lot of that going on. Fairfax escaped this, like we talked about a little bit. Because he was honorable, and also because he actually ended up helping facilitate the return of Charles II.
Right.
So he was allowed to sort of live out the rest of his days, and he was fine.
Right.
But most of them were treated very badly, and I think justifiably so.
Right.
But yeah, so he was dug up. Another guy named John Bradshaw and Henry Ireton, two other parliamentarians, were dug up and also executed. Interestingly, the body of his daughter was actually left alone. Yeah. They didn't touch it because she didn't have anything to do with it.
Yeah.
So his body was hung in chains in London and then thrown into a pit, basically. Right. And then his head was on a pole outside Westminster,
where Charles was executed
for the next 25 years.
20-foot pole right outside Westminster, where Charles was executed as a little bit of royalist revenge. And this was this head was really kind of like a horrifying, revengeful sight of this new monarchy, which admittedly was received pretty popularly.
Actually, and Charles II was actually a very popular king. He did fine.
When you impose stability on a country that's been at odds with itself for 20 years, you tend to gain a little bit of popularity. But this head, and I don't know how much you want to talk about Cromwell's head, but there's a whole. I remember when I was doing research for this, I saw I was reading on Oliver Cromwell Cromwell's wiki page, and then I saw like his head as a separate link, and I'm like, what's going on?
Yeah, because it's like, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was like stolen, and like they moved around a lot, and like nobody really knows where it is, but they think they have the right one.
They don't know if it's the right one. Hey, Oliver Cromwell was murdered. That wasn't his real body. That wasn't his real head. That's happened. You know,
maybe, who knows?
Yeah.
But anyway, like in terms of ceremonial representation, the head in front of Westminster for the next 20 years is a pretty strong symbol.
Right. And so, again, maybe a parallel. That's kind of a reminder of like, you know, look what we can do. In front of Parliament in 1899, all these years later, there's a statue of Cromwell, who famously killed the king, right?
Yeah.
So there is, you know, England, the very right of law, you know, polite place. There's a little passive aggressive.
Well, yes, I think absolutely that's the case. We think of England now as a very polished society.
Yeah, it is.
It was not always the case.
Not always the case, or maybe it would be polished, but things would rise to the surface.
Exactly.
Right.
So very interesting little bit of English history here for our listeners.
I think that about covers it. So, do you have anything you'd like to close with, Anton? Closing statements?
Definitely check out that video about the trial of King Charles if you're interested in like the legal
I'll put
arguments.
The link in the description.
Yep, absolutely. Thank you, Andy. And I think that, that's a great video about strictly the legal sort of aspect of this and why this was sort of a big deal in the history of law in general.
Right.
Also, you know, there's a film with, I forget what it's called, but I think it's Alec Guinness who plays King Charles.
Okay.
And there's, that you might be able to find somewhere probably for free, honestly. It's pretty good. I don't remember what it's called, but just look it up.
Okay.
So, yeah, other than that, definitely really interesting bit of English history. I don't think it's very commonly talked about.
At least not in America, because this is, I would say, this is huge. This is probably the beginning of the first, I would say this is kind of the beginning of the modern era, really.
Certainly in England.
Certainly in England, right? This is like the war prima facie. I'm not sure if I'm using that phrase correctly. This is like the war of England. You know, this is the one that they do in reenactments of, as we do in America. And this is the first time, like I said, you know, Parliament asserting their democracy over this divine right of kings. This is kind of the first hints of modernity, right? And we would see that as coming to like true culmination within the French Revolution. But this is, you know, some of this Protestant Reformation is kind of the opening chapter of modernity, as we see here. This Protestant Reformation, these Protestant currents really led to this whole you know, upheaval of the old traditional systems. And this system, you know, certainly the American revolutionists looked to the English Civil War when they were waging their own war, right? So maybe this wasn't like entirely like a highly politically radical thing. Maybe it was back in the day. I can't put myself in I
think it was. But it was radical in a different direction than maybe the French Republic was.
Right.
Because instead of like fighting for the rights of man, they were fighting for like a predecessor of the rights of man, and they were fighting for the weakening of the bonds of the churches.
Yeah, but it is interesting because it is radical. But what was Parliament? Like I said, I view it as like a reassertion of the aristocracy. So you kind of have this, you know, old as time, you know, first stage in governance asserting itself and kind of bringing forward a new world with this help with the Protestant Reformation. So that's just a little bit of my ending thoughts. Thank you again for listening to Science of History with Anton and Andy. You are listening to WMTU 91.9 FM. Good night and good luck.
Take care, everybody.